You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas. A couple of things we wanted to cover before we get into this week's episode. There's some very interesting cases that we've been following, in some cases for years. The Golden State Killer is certainly among the most high profile of those cases. This is the case involving 88 separate acts of violence committed by Joseph DeAngelo, the former cop in California who terrorized the state. He started out as the Visalia ransacker, referencing Visalia, California, and a series of burglaries there. He was then later referred to as the East Area Rapist, committing at least 50 sexual assaults and perhaps more in the area east of Sacramento, hence the name East Area Rapist. He was referred to as the original Night Stalker by newspapers and television reports back in the 80s, and then ultimately the case was renamed the Golden State Killer case by the late author Michelle McNamara. So now people kind of refer to the case as the Golden State Killer case. There is a hearing scheduled for Monday, June 29th. At the time we're recording this, there has been reporting that Joseph DeAngelo, in an effort to head off the death penalty, which we discuss in this episode of the podcast, may choose to enter a guilty plea perhaps to all 88 counts that he's currently charged with. It'll be very, very interesting to see how this unfolds, and obviously there will be a significant amount of coverage if DeAngelo and his lawyers make a decision to enter a guilty plea rather than face a death penalty charge in the state of California. One other thing I wanted to mention regarding the Golden State Killer case is there seems to be significant confusion about who the forensic genealogists were who helped solve the Golden State Killer case. For the record, Dr. Barbara Ray Venter, along with Paul Holes of the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Department and Steve Kramer of the FBI Los Angeles office, together with a team of forensic genealogists, are the people that solved the Golden State Killer case in terms of forensic genealogy. Obviously, hundreds of investigators, lab technicians, and journalists and so on have all contributed to helping solve the Golden State Killer case. But you really have to give credit to Barbara Ray Venter, and I really think it's important that credit go where credit is due. I think one thing that compounded the confusion was at the time this case was broken, which is a little over 2 years ago now, Barbara Ray Venter did not want her name associated with the case. And I met with Barbara Ray Venter for several hours in California about 2 years ago around this time. I was meeting her for the first time, but even I weighed in over a lengthy, very pleasant series of iced teas sitting outside in Carmel, California. Even I weighed in and said I thought that she should go public, as Paul Holes and Steve Kramer were urging her to do. Ultimately, she got to a place where she was more comfortable and willing to accept the credit for the work that she and her team had done. Congratulations to the families of the Golden State Killer victims and the survivors. I think that if this case moves forward in the way that is currently being reported, I think this would be of great benefit to the members of those families rather than a much-deserved process that could be very, very drawn out. As we touch on in this episode of Mind Over Murder, death penalty cases are incredibly complicated, and they can take years to bring to trial, and then you have the potential for appeals. And many of the victims and survivors of the Golden State Killer, these family members, are getting older. This case stretches back for decades. And these people have been waiting for justice for so many years for them to now be required to wait through a legal process that could last a decade or more. Some of these people will be dead before this case would ever actually be resolved. If the reporting is accurate and D'Angelo does choose to enter a plea, I think there is upside for the family members and the community members that were damaged by the Golden State Killer.
I agree with you 100%. It's going to be very interesting to see how these proceedings play out. That hearing is happening on Monday, June 29th, and we will look forward to seeing the outcome of that. Now, if you are interested in taking a deep dive into the case, the HBO series, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, does air on Sunday, June 28th. It is a 6-part series. We were just discussing the fact, interestingly enough, that it is not going to be bingeable. You can't watch all 6 parts.
Is that a word? Is that a word?
Well, I just made it a word, so we're going to say it's a word.
Okay, it's a word.
It's, Bill and I were just saying off the air how interesting it is. It's being aired the way that TV used to be aired, in that you get one shot to watch it. And if you miss that week's episode, oh well, they're moving to the next week after that. We're so used to being able to binge 6, 8, 10 episodes all at once that it took me a minute. I was like, what do you mean I can't watch all 6 episodes at once? That's craziness. But for those of our younger listeners who may not know, this is the way TV used to air back in the days. You had one shot to watch it. And if you missed it, you had to either wait for it to come out on, God help me, VHS. For those of us young enough to remember that.
Oh, now you're dating yourself.
I am, yeah. So I'll Be Gone in the Dark is airing on HBO this Sunday. That is tomorrow. We are recording this on a Saturday. It looks to be really excellent. If you haven't had a chance to watch the trailer for it, I do urge you to do so. It is going to be very, very interesting. And if you have not had a chance yet to read Michelle McNamara's book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, we also urge you to read that as well. It is excellent. And we had a good discussion on it in our episode 13. It was our first True Crime Bookshelf episode. And we do have another True Crime Bookshelf episode coming up. Never fear.
That's what's referred to as a tease in the podcast business.
So if you are interested in learning more about the book and you have not read it yet, please do see our episode 13 in our back catalog. And that is one of the books that we discuss on True Crime Bookshelf.
And coming up next here, we get back into our discussion on the Grim Sleeper case. As always, we thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder, and we hope you enjoy the show.
Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
We are continuing our coverage of the Grim Sleeper, and we are going to jump right back into our conversation. One of the things that I found fairly problematic with this case, and I know you did too, Bill, was the designation that the LAPD put on some of these case files. And that designation was NHI, which means no humans involved. That is really striking and very disconcerting.
And according to Nick Broomfield and other reporters, the NHI nomenclature would be used over the radio when these murders were called in. The code meant NHI, which was only characterized as NHI, meant that this was a crime that involved sex workers and drug addicts. The Los Angeles Police Department has a terrible reputation in terms of its race relations. And there have been racist cops in LA and other places around the country for decades. But in particular, the LAPD had a terrible reputation for its interaction with the African American community in South Central, certainly for decades in the 70s and 80s, leading up to the Rodney King riots, etc. And remember, that flashpoint of those riots, which have happened numerous times over the decades, this is the house that the LAPD built. Yeah. And to read over and over again, different reporters talk about NHI, and I didn't quite understand what NHI was.
And the only reason that I knew what it was, unsurprisingly, is because it was a code that showed up on CSI at one point in an episode where the team was dealing with cases of sex workers and drug addicts who were dumped in an area of Las Vegas. So I was familiar with the code. And when I heard that it was applied to this case, it really just made my blood boil.
Well, the whole thing with the Grim Sleeper case, and as I've said earlier in this podcast, I think this case should have been broken in 1988 with Anitria Washington surviving being attacked and providing incredibly detailed descriptions. It's also reported widely that except for some agitation by community leaders in 1989, the LAPD apparently had no intention whatsoever of announcing something which they had known for years, which was they had at least one and possibly multiple serial killers in South Central Los Angeles. So they weren't even giving as much as a heads up to the sex workers in the neighborhood that they needed to be cautious about who their Johns were. And again, we're not attaching any value judgment to someone that may have gotten involved in sex work or become addicted to crack, which was just epidemic at the time. As you pointed out earlier, Kristin, Lonnie Franklin Jr. chose to prey on these people because these women were among the most vulnerable potential victims out there.
Precisely. And every human being, no matter what your status in life, deserves to be treated with respect, especially if they've been the victim of a crime. And the fact that that code, no humans involved, NHI, was applied to any of these women, it saddens me. It upsets me. In a lot of the reporting that I've seen over and over, you had family members who said they felt that the LAPD could care less about their loved one's case. And then they went on to follow that up by saying it would have been different if my loved one was a white woman who had disappeared or been murdered on the streets. I don't think that's an unjustifiable criticism. I think that they're probably right. And they certainly have every right to speak out about the fact that they felt they were treated badly and that their family members were not given the kind of respect that they deserve.
Even during the era where we've been reporting out on the Grim Sleeper case, even though Bernard Parks had come in as the chief of police and was there for a number of years, and he himself is African American, it just didn't seem to change the culture of the LAPD, and they didn't seem to care about these individuals. And I recognize that South Central was and is a tough neighborhood and was a difficult beat for LAPD officers to cover, but somehow we've really reached a dark point when we're referencing multiple murders and women's bodies being dumped in alleys literally like trash, and the cops are calling it in as an NHI, no humans involved. No one's ever going to solve a case if we're not even thinking of the victims and the perpetrator as humans worthy of intervention, investigation, and, as I've said many times on the podcast, time, attention, and resources.
It almost seems as if Lonnie Franklin saw himself as cleaning house, cleaning up the streets, something along those lines. He was preying on the most marginalized women in this neighborhood. You know, we had mentioned earlier, Lonnie Franklin Jr. did not engage in recreational drug use, but he had no problem giving it to women when he thought that it would help him gain control of them. Again, I'm not a profiler. I know a couple, but that doesn't really mean a whole lot. I read a ton of true crime books. That doesn't mean I know a whole lot about the profiling process, but it seems to me like he had a major power and control issue here. And this is a person who feels like if he can gain power over someone weaker than him, he was going to do it. And he clearly looked down on these women and felt that they were less than him, people who did not deserve to be a part of his community, a part of his streets. And that it's awful. It's a terrible way to look at all of this. It was 2007. The murder of Janisha Peters had prompted Detective Dennis Kilcoyne to ask LA Police Chief Bill Bratton if he could please assemble a task force of 6 detectives known as the 800 Task Force to look into the murders that could all be connected to each other and would eventually form the Grim Sleeper murders. It did take Bill Bratton a little bit of time to acquiesce to this request, but eventually he did so. This task force of 6 detectives began to not only investigate the murders, but did the best that they could to reach out to the community in South Central. I guess you could call it ground zero for the killings. So the members of the 800 Task Force reached out to detectives that they knew in vice and in homicide to put them on alert. There is still a serial killer who is working in this area. They spoke to the local prostitutes just to let them know, hey, this is happening. Be cautious, be canny, know that we are out there and that we are there to help. But there was no large scale effort on the part of Bill Bratton or Mayor Villaraigosa to alert LA to the larger problem. There is a serial killer in South Central LA.
Nobody with any pull, no homeowners association, no local chamber of commerce was demanding answers to 10 murders by the same guy in the poor section of town. And I can't help but note that if these same 10 murders had taken place on what they call the west side of Los Angeles, that is West Hollywood, where we used to live, Brentwood, Beverly Hills, heaven forbid, Santa Monica, there would have been an alert at all levels of the LAPD as well as in the media. Because these 10 or more murders had taken place in South Central Los Angeles and were all women of color from the margins, no one seemed to be paying attention. And even Dennis Kilcoyne, the detective, pushing for this task force after it became very clear that the serial murderer that they were tracking in the 1980s with no success was back as of 2002. It's actually shocking how little attention was paid to this case until the task force was finally put together and the investigation began to move forward again.
And I particularly like the fact that Kristin Pelisek, in her coverage of the case in LA Weekly, she had no problem calling out the LAPD and the mayor's office and basically telling them, hey, look, you would not be reacting the same if this was happening in any place other than South Central. I'm going to go ahead and quote from an article here from the LA Weekly. A Bratton press aide on August 26 told the Weekly the chief was too busy to discuss the Grim Sleeper murders and offered to provide comment from lower LAPD brass. On the same day, although Bratton could not set aside time to discuss the 11 murders in South Los Angeles, he got big media play at a Parker Center press conference touting the arrest of the West Side's silverware bandit, a man who had been stealing cutlery and china.
And there's the difference between the West Side, the affluent, largely white West Side of Los Angeles, versus the South Side of Los Angeles. There it is in a nutshell. Chief Bratton has time to announce that arrest of a guy who's stealing cutlery in China. I mean, I can't even get the words out.
I know.
And Dennis Kilcoyne said at the time, I have briefed Bratton 4 or 5 times. He was fully aware of what we are going through. He thinks we have our work cut out for us. Every time he sees us, he says, good luck. I assume that wasn't meant in an ironic fashion.
We could sit here and cast aspersions and lay blame all day long, and we're not going to much. But
okay, not much.
But you certainly just cannot get around the fact that the LAPD did not do its due diligence to the people of South Central by their response to all of these murders that were taking place.
Agreed.
I think that's about as much aspersion casting and blame laying that I want to do right at the moment. But
we'll get back to it later.
Yeah, let's hold the option open for doing more of it as we see fit, as necessary.
As the case unfolds and as it's warranted.
Yes. So the task force was continuing to investigate and weren't having a lot of luck until they heard about familial DNA. Now, we don't want to get too terribly much into familial DNA right now, not because we don't have a ton of information, we do, but because we would like Colleen Fitzpatrick to get into it more. She worked on the Grim Sleeper case and was... How would you characterize her reaction when we called her and said, would you like to talk about this case?
She was very excited. And she'll be joining us next time to tell us the story about how familial DNA helped break this case. And it really is fascinating. Thankfully, she'll also explain to us how familial DNA works and how it can be used in other cases to help put together suspects and individuals whose names have come up in investigations. It can be determined whether they should be ruled in or out as potential suspects.
So because we don't want to spoil Colleen's fun, we're not going to get too heavily into the particulars of this. But it is important to know that ultimately what brought the Grim Sleeper down was the use of familial DNA. It was very interesting. If you read the LA Weekly's coverage of the Grim Sleeper case, the first article about the case is basically revealing the existence of the LAPD task force and the existence of a serial killer operating in South Central. At that point, Lonnie Franklin had not been caught. But there was this consciousness that there is hope on the horizon if familial DNA can be used. So I'm going to go ahead and quote again from this article that will give you a little bit of an idea of where her thinking was when Kristin Pelisek wrote this. Experts believe that roughly 40% of violent criminals have relatives in jail. If the Grim Sleeper's familial DNA popped up in a survey of the state offenders database of more than 1 million DNA profiles, the LA killer might finally be identified by family name. And that's pretty much exactly what happened.
And by the way, pretty amazing that in the state of California alone, there are 1 million DNA profiles in their DNA database.
Yeah, that kind of blows my mind. And that is not, by the way, we want to make sure that everybody is clear. In order for familial DNA to be used in the Grim Sleeper case, pressure had to be brought to bear on Attorney General Jerry Brown to allow its use. And this was a fight that, it was a fight. It was very, very much a fight. Brown did not want DNA databases to be used for that purpose. I'm going to quote from LA Weekly. Last May, Brown publicly announced that he would allow familial DNA surveys of the California prisoner database, but only if all other leads had been exhausted and the criminal being sought posed a threat, a description that fits the Grim Sleeper to a T. And that was from the LA Weekly article in May of 2008. So eventually, after a protracted fight with Attorney General Jerry Brown, familial DNA was brought to bear on the Grim Sleeper case. And it turned out that Lonnie Franklin's son, Christopher, we mentioned him way back at the start of the podcast, had been arrested on a charge of felony weapons possession in 2009. At that point of his arrest, his DNA was taken, and it was placed in California's DNA database. In early 2010, the DNA from the Grim Sleeper crime scenes was run through that database and came back with multiple alleles in common with Christopher Franklin. And knowing that he was too young to be the killer, investigators surmised that the killer was probably a relative, either a father or an uncle.
With Christopher Franklin being too young, yet they knew they had a close DNA match here. They knew they had to go back likely a generation in order to have a perpetrator that would have been involved in these rapes and murders in the 80s and 90s. And there was Lonnie Franklin with his extensive criminal background right there, as I said earlier, literally under their nose.
So again, we're going to let Colleen get into the...
One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helps solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com. Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristin and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you.
Ins and outs of it, but the upshot of all of this was that undercover officers obtained Lonnie Franklin's DNA by following him to a birthday party at John's Incredible Pizza Company. An officer who was posing as a busboy obtained his plate, his cup, and then a pizza crust. And it was the crust that had enough DNA on it to link him to the murders.
I remember the headlines when this arrest hit the press, and they kept talking about the pizza bites, the actual teeth mark from Lonnie Franklin Jr. biting into the pizza. And I know most of us don't think about this. We're leaving DNA behind everywhere we go, even in the half-eaten crust of pizza that we leave behind at John's Incredible Pizza Company.
Which I'd never heard of before. I'm assuming that's a local chain.
I never had either.
So at that point, finally, with the DNA match, Lonnie Franklin was arrested in 2010 of the Grim Sleeper murders. As the wheels of justice grind very, 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 very slowly, Lonnie Franklin did not go to trial until 2016.
Some of our listeners may remember that at the time of this recording, the Golden State Killer case may be headed towards a plea arrangement. Now, this Grim Sleeper case can give you an idea of one of the reasons why they may be moving the Golden State Killer case forward. These death penalty cases, like Lonnie Franklin Jr. and the Golden State Killer case involving Joseph D'Angelo, drag on for years. There is a concern that with elderly victims, that they may never see any form of rough justice if they're forced to wait for half a decade or more for an individual to be brought to trial in an extremely complicated case. Both of these cases are extremely complicated with potentially dozens of victims, multiple jurisdictions, and on and on and on. And then you may have appeals. Cases like this can stretch on for a decade or more, although you may feel strongly that these cases should be moving forward more rapidly than they do. The truth is, as Kristin says, the wheels of justice do turn very, very slowly.
The pretrial hearings for this dragged on and on and on. And there was certainly some stalling and delay tactics used by his defense attorneys, certainly some theatrics as well. If you want the full story on the trial and the trial prep, again, I'm going to continue to tout Kristin Pelisek's book. It's quite excellent. I was just reading through the chapters about the trial in preparation for this podcast earlier today. But there's so many sort of forces at play here that we don't tend to think about, because unless you're trained as a lawyer, or you're part of the criminal justice system in that way, you probably don't start to think about all of the needs that have to be satisfied here. Judges end up being concerned that a really expensive case is going to get overturned on appeal. So they make sure that they give their defense attorneys time to prep, a lot of it in some cases. Defense attorneys, especially ones in California and other cases with the death penalty, tend to drag out their proceedings in the hopes that at some point or another, someone's going to do away with the death penalty and they won't have to worry about the whole entire thing. I didn't really have a sense of how many stakeholders there are in a criminal case until I started reading this section of the book.
Keeping in mind, too, that a defense attorney, and we're not here to advocate for defense attorneys, but part of their job in their mind is to keep their clients alive. And so a long, protracted process of discovery and the various legal steps that are required is keeping their client alive. Now, those of us that are seeking justice, and I'm speaking as the brother of a murder victim here, may find this whole process incredibly frustrating. I think lots of people think to themselves, can't we move this process along? From the perspective of the defendant and his or her defense attorneys, a go slow approach can serve them well.
And it was interesting, too, that the victims' families really, I appreciated the fact that they did step forward and advocate for themselves, that they did not want to just wait and wait and wait for those wheels of justice to sort of grind slowly forward. Ultimately, after 5 years, in February of 2015, the victims' families as a whole went to the court and they chose to invoke, it's called Marsy's Law, which is sort of the familiar name for the California Victims' Bill of Rights. And that's from 2008. I wasn't familiar with the concept of the Victims' Bill of Rights until I started researching the Colonial Parkway murders case and started really getting involved in advocacy and criminal justice. But I like the fact that victims have rights and that there is a set of expectations that you can hope for when you are the friend or family member of a murder victim. So I'm going to go ahead and quote here again. The law called for increased rights for victims and their families in the judicial process. Among them, the safety of victims and their families would be a consideration when setting bail for the accused, mandatory notification of all court proceedings, the right to address the court at every stage of trial proceeding, the right to seek restitution, and the right to a speedy trial. And of course, the right to a speedy trial is what the victims' families ultimately invoked. And they went to the judge and basically said, look, some of us have been waiting more than 2 decades for justice. Please set a trial date. And ultimately, Judge Kathleen Kennedy did set that trial date for June 30th, 2015 at the behest of the families. But of course, criminal justice being what it is, the case did not actually get to trial until February of 2016. So still delays. And Bill's grinning at me, although I'm not entirely sure why.
Because even when the judge made the commitment to June 30th, 2015, it was still more than 6 months late in finally getting started in February of 2016.
But ultimately, when it did get started, it went. It did happen, and the trial lasted a total of 3 months. It featured more than 40 prosecution witnesses, including survivor Anitria Washington. There was testimony from the LAPD search team who spent 3 days combing through Lonnie Franklin's house and garage. I was very interested to note that search on his house was the largest in LAPD history. And it actually included a mobile command post that was parked outside. There's some aerial footage in the documentary I was watching last night of this search, and it's got a massive mobile command post. They called it the pit. And it's like they've cordoned off sections of this street. There were just canopies everywhere. I would not have wanted to live on that street that day trying to get in and out of my house when LAPD is swarming the street and trying to uncover all of this evidence. So ultimately, the search on Lonnie Franklin's house uncovered hundreds of photos of women that we've talked about already. Among the photos were photos of Janisha Peters and Ms. Washington. They also found a lot of women's lingerie, tons of it. He kept some of it as trophies and some of it he gave to his female friends. They found boxes of .25 caliber bullets. They found rolls of cash. They found the .25 caliber gun that was used to kill Janisha Peters in his bedroom. So if you want a huge amount of evidence, they found it. And so there was a lot of testimony on the part of the LAPD officers who went in and searched and found all of this evidence.
Yeah, if anything, Franklin gave them quite a tremendous amount of evidence and effectively a roadmap, photographs included, of many of his victims.
So ultimately, when all was said and done, Lonnie Franklin was convicted of first-degree murder for the deaths of 10 women. And because we feel victims are very important, I'm going to go ahead and read their names to you now. Deborah Jackson, Henrietta Wright, Barbara Ware, Bernita Sparks, Mary Lowe, Lucretia Jefferson, Monique Alexander, Princess Bartomeu, Valerie McCorvey, and Janisha Peters. He was also convicted on one account of attempted murder, and that, of course, was for the shooting, I guess you could almost call what he did to her an abduction, of Anitria Washington. And for each of those counts, he did receive the death penalty.
And it was interesting that during the penalty phase of the trial, that prosecutors presented additional evidence involving 4 other murder victims.
I hadn't heard about this before, that you could actually bring in new evidence during the penalty phase. But yeah, they did bring in quite a bit. I guess if we wanted to give an updated total, we would need to sort of redo the timeline. They did find 4 other murders that Lonnie Franklin could be linked to by way of evidence that was found in his house. And that would be the 1984 murder of Sharon Dismuke, age 21, which would technically make her his first victim. Inez Warren, I'm sorry if I'm butchering names, age 28. She was murdered in August of 1988. Georgia Mae Thomas, age 43, murdered in December of 2000. And Relania Morris, 31, who was murdered in September of 2005, although her body was never recovered.
This is another indicator, by the way, that I think that Franklin was able to dispose of bodies of his victims. Now, here's a situation where they found her driver's license and several photographs of her in Lonnie Franklin Jr.'s home, but never found the body. And I think it's quite possible that there are other victims whose bodies have never been found, especially from that so-called 13-year sleep period.
Yeah, they were ultimately unable to link him to the disappearance and probable murder of 18-year-old Ayala Marshall, who disappeared in February of 2005. But her school ID card was found in his garage. Does seem like he kept trophies of the women that he killed, so I think you can make the logical leap from there. They were not able to present enough evidence to link him definitively to her disappearance. I was also very interested in the fact that during the penalty phase, the woman that he raped in Germany so long ago, Ingrid W., was actually brought in to testify during the penalty phase of the trial.
Boy, talk about your past catching up with you.
Oh my God. I can't even imagine. So Lonnie Franklin Jr. was formally sentenced on August 10th, 2016. And as I mentioned before, he did receive the death sentence for each count of murder. And in addition, he received a sentence of life imprisonment for the count of attempted murder. Now, during the penalty phase, 17 family members chose to make victim impact statements. Among those people who chose to make the victim impact statement was a statement from a woman named Laura Moore. She was a 52-year-old woman who called the police after seeing a report about Lonnie Franklin's arrest and conviction. She offered the information and a story very, very similar to Anitri Washington's, that she also had been shot in the chest and left for dead by Lonnie Franklin in 1985.
Yeah, the list of victims just goes on and on and on in this case.
And I would imagine that there are many more. There will be many that we have no idea about, that we can't ultimately link to him. This is a guy who he very clearly was not interested in stopping and felt no remorse or empathy. Now, California does have the death penalty, but it has had a moratorium on the death penalty since January of 2006. So ultimately, Lonnie Franklin sat on death row for 6 years. And the last person to be put to death in California was a man by the name of Clarence Ray Allen, 76 years old. And that was the last person who was put to death before that moratorium was imposed.
And what's the total number of people on death row in California? It's over
737.
Amazing.
737. Lonnie Franklin, as we mentioned at the top of the pod, Lonnie Franklin was found dead in his jail cell in San Quentin in March of 2020. Actually, just a couple months ago. Mm-hmm. He was 67 years old. Cause of death is still pending. The autopsy either has not been done or it has not been, the results have not been revealed. We're really not entirely sure what the deal is there. That was, I feel, a very fitting end for Lonnie Franklin to just rot in jail.
And by the way, Governor Gavin Newsom of California did announce last year via executive order that there would be no further death penalty executions in the state of California. But it is important to note that even without that executive order, California hasn't killed anyone via lethal injection since 2006. So even though this is one of the largest death row populations in the country, no one's really been put to death there for 14 years now.
This whole case it's really, I said we were going to stop, offering criticism of the LAPD, but I feel like I kind of want to pick that up again for a second.
What set you off?
No, just looking at the whole of, I'm sitting here scanning my notes, making sure that we've covered everything. And I don't have the words to offer a scathing enough condemnation of the LAPD and the work that they did not do in ensuring the safety of the women in South Central Los Angeles. Now, I realize that because I am not in law enforcement, I'm sure that there are any number of people who would say, who are you to criticize? You're not in law enforcement. You don't know what it's like to live and work in a big city, to deal with a murder rate that massive. You have no idea what you're talking about. Slow your roll. And they would be right. But there are so many women who were served so poorly by the people who should have been looking out for them, who should have taken an interest when the first woman disappeared and then turned up dead. And nobody did anything. And that's, as a woman, I find that infuriating and outrageous, and it pisses me off. I'm pissed off on their behalf, and maybe I don't have a right to be, but part of me is like, yeah, I do have a right to be. I'm a woman. every woman deserves to be protected by law enforcement, and these women weren't. And yeah, I don't normally go on rants, but I did. I just ranted, didn't I?
You did.
It's pretty cool of me.
And as I mentioned, I'll chime in as well. When we got to 1988 and Anitria Washington survived as victim number 9 and gave the LAPD a very, very good description of this gentleman, what he looked like, what he wore, what kind of car he was driving. They recovered a .25 caliber bullet from her body, and he used that same weapon to kill a number of these women, not all of them, but a number of them. They had so much to work with her alone, and she survived. And yet her incredibly compelling story went ignored. This guy should have been arrested in 88, not 2 decades later. It's infuriating. And I cannot help but think that if this group of women had been affluent and white and from the west side of Los Angeles, as we talked about, this case would not have dragged on for 2 decades.
I agree with you 100%. So I've continually touted the excellent work from Kristin Pelisek on working on this case. But I do want to also shout out Nick Broomfield, who directed Tales of the Grim Sleeper, which was a documentary from HBO. He spent a lot of time driving around the streets of South Central, meeting Lonnie Franklin's friends and neighbors. He actually talked to his son, Christopher. And one of the things that he did in the film that I thought was particularly moving is that he found a number of women who were actually on LAPD's composite board. Like they were women who had had their pictures taken by Lonnie Franklin but had survived him. And he found them and asked them if they would describe their stories on camera. And so there's a 15-minute montage right at the end of all 6 of these women describing these harrowing escapes from a very violent, reprehensible Lonnie Franklin. And Broomfield asked them at one point, why didn't you go to the police? And they said, it wasn't going to do me any good. Why would I go to the police?
That's the amount of faith that the people that lived in that neighborhood had in law enforcement, which was next to zero.
It is very interesting listening to the stories of these women. It is heartbreaking too, and it is harrowing. It is upsetting. I definitely sat there and cried listening to them talk about this because it was the first time for some of them that they had talked about the awful crime that had been perpetuated against them. One of the women said something that I had to go back and listen to it again and again because it really just, it kind of hit me. She said, and she went unnamed in the documentary. Understandably, I think she did not want to draw law enforcement attention. And she said, tearfully as she's describing this, yeah, okay, I was out there. She means on the street. But it doesn't mean I'm nothing. It doesn't mean I'm nothing like a piece of trash. I was trapped. That is not what I wanted. That is not the life that I wanted. And it hit me. These are women who have been underserved by their communities and underserved by law enforcement. And Lonnie Franklin preyed upon them. They're the most vulnerable, marginalized members of society, and he preyed on them. And I just find him completely reprehensible.
One other thing I want to add, we've talked about how this case highlights a number of different problems with American law enforcement. Here's another one to add to the mix. As we mentioned earlier in the podcast, Lonnie Franklin was a career criminal, and he'd been arrested any number of times. I found this shocking. In 2003, Franklin was convicted on a felony count. And at that time, DNA was supposed to be collected from everyone who was convicted of a felony in the state of California. But because law enforcement didn't have sufficient resources to collect the DNA, his DNA went uncollected during 2003, 2004, and 2005. If it had been collected properly at the time of his felony conviction, he would have likely shown up in the CODIS system and the statewide database with the million DNA profiles, and they would have gotten a direct hit had the DNA been properly collected in 2004. So it isn't just a matter of we have all these amazing systems. As Rock Harmon, a DNA expert, has told me before, unless we're collecting the DNA from everyone whose DNA can legally be collected and placing that DNA into the appropriate DNA databases for search, the system completely falls apart. And it did in this example. The Lonnie Franklin Jr. case is a classic example of a case with missed opportunity after missed opportunity. And if things had been properly followed up as far back as the 80s, this guy should have been in jail since that far back, and a number of these women would still be alive today.
I think that's probably a pretty good note to end on. If you are interested in learning more about the Grim Sleeper, we do encourage you to take a look at the reporting in LA Weekly from Kristin Pelisek, or take a look at her book, which is called The Grim Sleeper, The Lost Women of South Central. That is available on Kindle. That's how I'm reading it, at least. There are also any number of documentaries about the Grim Sleeper case that you could take a look at. One that I did watch and enjoy was by Nick Broomfield, and it is called Tales of the Grim Sleeper, and that is from HBO. Final thoughts, Bill?
Well, when we talk to you next time, we'll have DNA expert and friend of the show, Colleen Fitzpatrick, return to give us a more in-depth description of how familial DNA works and how she helped use familial DNA to identify and ultimately bring Lonnie Franklin Jr. to justice.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Sources used in this week's episode include
reporting from Nick Broomfield in Tales of the Grim Sleeper, an HBO documentary. Kristin Pelisek reporting in the LA Weekly. Also Kristin Pelisek in her book, The Grim Sleeper, The Lost Women of South Central. Hollie Silverman of CNN.com. And Suzanne Zappello of Rolling Stone magazine.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.